So here I was, an immigrant teenager trying to fit into high school, trying to be cool, trying to master my moonwalking skills and a whole lot of highly important activities. And then at the age of 16, one of my contemporaries by the name of Mona Mahmoudnejad, who was a high school student in Shiraz, was arrested. And her crime was having written an essay in which she criticized the violation of the human rights of the Baha'i minority, who were being subject to systematic discrimination, whose leadership had been systematically executed. And in this essay, she asked the simple question of, why are you denying my human rights? Why are you denying my freedom of belief, my freedom of conscience, my freedom of expression? So Mona was sent to prison, where for several months she was subject to brutal torture. And in June of 1983, I will explain what her fate was just now, but Mona's death, which I will now describe, was that sort of turning point in my life where I developed the knowledge of suffering in a very intimate way. I experienced the rage that comes with feeling injustice, and that was the beginning of my journey. So I will just share with you some pages from that experience, and I apologize in advance if some of it may be distressing. On March 12, 1983, Mona's father was hanged with several other Baha'is in a polo field in Shiraz. Their lives extinguished where the game of kings was once played. Mona wept in her prison cell, remembering her final farewell, when she had kissed his eyes, knowing that the end had come. It was now her time to say farewell. She knew what awaited her, but she was determined to live her last hours with courage and dignity. Her mother recounted the few minutes they were given to say their final goodbyes. We walked a little way, and then she stopped. She looked into my eyes and said, "Mum, you do know that they're going to execute me." Suddenly, my whole being seemed to be on fire. I didn't want to believe her. I said, "No, my dear daughter, they're going to let you go. You will get married and have children. My greatest wish is to see your children." Mona's mother was in desperate denial, but she could no longer escape the reality of her daughter's impending execution. She recounted how Mona comforted her as they bid farewell for the last time. I felt so small before the greatness of her soul, as if she were the mother and I the child. On the evening of June 18, 1983, the head of Adilabad prison called out the name of Mona and 9 other Baha'i women. Under cover of darkness, they were driven in a minibus to the same polo field where her father had been executed. The driver, devastated by what he saw, would later recount what transpired on that terrible, infamous night. The 10 women were hanged one by one. Mona was the last one to be brought onto the scaffold. She had been forced to watch the agonizing deaths of all her friends. She had endured months of ruthless torture. She had suffered unspeakably at the loss of her father. And now in her last moments, the merciless men that were about to snuff out her precious life were subjecting her to vicious insults. As Mona stood on the gallows, in a final act of defiance, she smiled at her executioner. When the story of Mona's ordeal reached me, I became dazed and devastated. It took some time for the reality of her execution to sink in. Here I was, a Canadian teenager, worried about popularity among my high school friends, while back in Iran, the youth were being killed for writing an essay. It became increasingly difficult to reconcile my mundane concerns with the enormity of what had transpired. This was not a passing soundbite in the television news, an unfortunate event in a distant place, an abstract victim soon to be forgotten. This was an intimate lived experience. It sliced through my complacency like a knife. I'd arrived in Canada, dreaming in the clouds. Now I found myself in the dark abyss of a recurring nightmare. I was a spectator, watching helplessly as our loved ones were killed, as the innocent world I once knew was irretrievably shattered. Looking back from my place of exile, I felt an overwhelming rage and sorrow. I became numb with inextinguishable pain. Mona's death changed everything. I would never be the same person again. So we all have our moments. That was my moment as a teenager, trying to understand why her and not me. What was the difference between us? It was totally random that my family was in Canada and she was in Iran. And I asked myself, what does it mean to live in a free country if it's wasted on selfish mediocrity and consumerism? So at that moment, I had a choice. I had a choice to turn my back or to go on this journey into the unknown. And that's why I think I had no choice. I had, for the sake of keeping my own sanity, to ask the questions and to go on this journey to understand why people do such things and why we allow it to happen. I think about the famous aphorism, all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So the journey then brought me to the halls of Harvard Law School, where I was classmates with this skinny kid called Barack. And I was amidst these incredibly successful, accomplished, ambitious students who would all go on to do something very impressive. I'd come speaking a few words of English now. I was at this incredibly prestigious institution, but I felt right from the start that there was something missing. That looking at the world from 30,000 feet, everyone paid lip service to the right ideas, but no one understood what suffering really means. From there, I ended up, by accident, becoming the first legal advisor to the UN War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was established after 40 years of Cold War politics in which there was complete impunity for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I remember the conversation that those of us who were human rights advocates within the UN system would have with those that were in the peace process. And our instinctive, sort of blindingly obvious idea that those that commit crimes against humanity must be brought to justice, which was ridiculed by the decision makers as some sort of, human rights utopia that's oblivious to political reality. So we asked, what is political reality except a reflection of our own choices? And in the end, it was remarkable to see how those that spoke in the name of political realism, that the only way we're going to have peace in Bosnia is if we sweep these crimes under the carpet and forget them, how they came to the conclusion that it's impossible to have peace and stability in a multi-ethnic society if ethnic hate mongers, we call them ethnic entrepreneurs, those that are the pyromaniacs that instrumentalize hatred to rip apart this diverse society, were not brought to justice, that was the naive, unrealistic political calculation. So right from the start, I tried to reconcile the reality of the suffering I saw on the ground in the streets of Bosnia with those a world away that were making the decisions that would decide the fate of these people. One of the remarkable things was Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which was written as a description of what was happening in Bosnia. And Professor Huntington, sitting there in Harvard, who I think has never read a book on Bosnian history, let alone spoken to someone from the streets of Sarajevo, where every other person I met came from a mixed marriage, came up with the idea that, well, of course, people from different religions kill each other. That's just what we do. And this clash of civilizations nonsense gained such currency that it began to shape the thinking of policymakers, whereas on the ground, there was a completely different reality. So those were some of the powerful lessons that were learned. And one of the other powerful lessons I learned is that when, despite all of our prognosis, the Yugoslav tribunal became a remarkable success, and we ended up prosecuting the former president of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, who was once invincible, untouchable. So it was an incredible moral triumph, because all of a sudden, a political space was created for accountability. Now we have an international criminal court, even though it's still very weak on the periphery of power, but the mere fact that we have such a court that can prosecute political and military leaders is absolutely revolutionary by the standards of history. But at the end, I realized that the crimes that were committed explode the limits of the law. How can you punish genocide? Yes, we must punish these people. We must bring them to justice. There must be a reckoning for the crimes of the past in order to allow people to heal and to move on to a better future. But I realized that justice can't bring back the dead. So I began to ask the question of, well, is genocide inevitable? Is it like a tsunami, an earthquake, a natural disaster? And much of our popular imagination looks at mass atrocities in that way. When we turn on the news and we hear about Myanmar, yesterday it was South Sudan, Darfur, Rwanda, whatever the case may be, we feel powerless because we don't understand the sequence of horrible decisions that gave rise to that reality. And once we understand the anatomy of evil, then we are poised to actually measure success by what doesn't happen. To understand that by the time something becomes headline news, it's already too late. We've already failed. And I learned that in Rwanda, a story which I tell through the story of my student Eloge Butera, who survived the genocide to come and study law at McGill, one of the wonderful things about the many outstanding students I've had there, some of whom are here with us tonight. And Eloge managed to come to law school because he was denied admission to another school, the ETO school in Kigali, where the Belgian peacekeepers were positioned. Some 2,000 people came to shelter there, and they were safe because of the UN. Eloge's family arrived too late. There was no room for them. They were turned away. Eloge thought he was going to die. But that is what saved his life, because within 48 hours, the UN withdrew all of the peacekeepers, and almost every one of those 2,000 people were killed, including Eloge's best friend, Samuel, who's now the namesake for his beautiful 3-year-old boy. So Rwanda was a televised Holocaust. That's what it was. 1 million people killed in 3 months, 2 to 3 times the killing rate of the Nazi concentration camps. And exactly a year to the date before the UN Security Council resolution that withdrew the peacekeepers, President Clinton was at the US Holocaust Memorial saying, "Never again." It's not never again, it's ever again. Because we engage in this fetishistic Holocaust remembrance, we mourn the crimes of the past, but we don't want to connect them to the challenges of the present. Why? Because we don't want to pay a price for our beliefs. We just want to cloak ourselves in the mantle of righteousness, but we don't want to sacrifice anything. And I look at Rwanda and how one simple solution was simply to shut down the famous RTLM radio that was the mouthpiece of the extremists, without which they could never have mobilized the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people in every town and village in Rwanda to do the killing. In a country with 70% illiteracy, where 90% of the people lived in rural areas, that one radio station was what I call a weapon of mass destruction. So take heed in the age of false news and take seriously incitement to hatred. It's famously said that the Holocaust didn't begin in the gas chambers, it began with words. But it's also empowering to realize that if there was someone in a position of authority who cared to understand what was happening in Rwanda, merely shutting down that radio station could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But the fact is, no one gave a damn about Rwanda. There was no oil, no minerals, no geopolitical significance, and no politician would lose a single vote for abandoning 1 million Africans to die. It's as simple as that. That's why I speak about empathy, which invites the scorn and ridicule of the sophisticated intellectuals who say, oh, but you sound like Gwyneth Paltrow's gook, or whatever the case may be. And, well, guess what? You tell me why no one did anything about Rwanda. Is it because we didn't have a brilliant policy? No, because no one felt the pain and suffering of those people. It didn't matter. It's as simple as that.